Evil spirits were once blamed for medieval plagues. But science has revealed our true enemy, microscopic bacteria. Today, these unseen organisms kill a person every 22 seconds. We fight them with antibiotics, but they're not miracle drugs. Bacteria superbugs have adapted to resist our best weapons. Will disease hunters be able to stop the next bacteria pandemic?
Bacteria are some of the most ubiquitous life forms on Earth, and some of the oldest life forms on Earth. They've explored every frontier. Essentially, every place on Earth is colonized by bacteria.
Including humans.
Life does depend on bacteria. Carbon cycles, nitrogen cycles, the oxygenation of the air. Those all depend on bacteria.
Research scientist Swain Chen has a lifelong fascination with bacteria.
We're in the evolution garden here at the Botanic Gardens, and it's about how plants evolved and changed the landscape of the Earth. But plants weren't around for the first few billion years of Earth's history, and that's because we're waiting for bacteria to create the oxygen that would support them. Even down to your immune system, your ability to resist certain pathogens, or your ability to process nutrients. Those all rely on bacteria as well. It's true that we don't exist without them.
But what happens when bacteria work against us? July 13th, 2015. 50-year-old Tan Hui Boon is rushed to Khoo Teck Puat Hospital in Singapore after a night of vomiting, diarrhea, and bouts of fever. In and out of consciousness, Tan has no idea that he has become a victim of one of the biggest bacteria outbreaks in Singapore, which claims 238 victims. 160 were hospitalized with severe food poisoning, while others were admitted with various infections.
Septic arthritis, meningitis. So arthritis means swollen joints, painful joints, infected joints. Meningitis is a disease, an infection around the brain. So these are invasive, important infections, serious infections. In healthy people, no way is that allowed. You know, one or two, okay, but a series? Something's going on.
A new strain of bacterial infection may have surfaced in Singapore.
These patients were infected with Group B Streptococcus.
Group B strep is in all of our guts, and also in females it's in the vagina. Group B strep simply should not be, it does not deserve to be, it's not allowed to cause disease, invasive disease, in healthy adults. That's not what it normally does.
Intrigued by the unusual nature of this outbreak, Barkham, a veteran medical microbiologist who is always on the lookout for possible new diseases, turned to his vault. A freezer full of bacteria collected throughout his tenure at the hospital.
Those are GBS from 2014. I went back to 2005 and plotted the number of invasive infections, that's bacteremia. And if you look, it's almost just up and down for years, and then suddenly in the last year or so, it's gone up.
Barkham wanted more data from his colleagues in other hospitals to validate his suspicions.
But there was enough of a signal to say, send me your bacteria, guys. If you're happy sending me your bacteria, I'll do all the laboratory work on them.
Barkham's chief medical technologist, Tang Wen Ying, started extracting DNA from the bacteria to determine if they were from the same strain.
These little Group B streps, they have a little capsule, which is like a little coat, and they can be differentiated according to the different kinds of coats, as in label 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Meanwhile, in the hospital, Tan is fighting for his life. His body is going into septic shock. The GBS bacteria has entered his bloodstream. These hostile microbes are getting a free ride to his major organs. His immune system goes into overdrive, releasing antibodies to fight the infection. But this over-vigorous immune response is actually turning on its host, causing inflammation and swelling. Tan's blood pressure starts falling fast, dangerously restricting oxygen supply to his vital organs.
Hi, Wenying.
Hi, Dr. Bakang.
What have you got?
Yeah, there's lots of type tree from different hospitals.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. About half of them.
Yes.
7 out of 15 are all type 3.
Yes.
What we found, a lot of the bacteria were serotype 3. And if we compare the data from 2014 with 2015, look here, it says serotype 3 early in 2015 and already had an increase of 16%, whereas all the other serotypes had nothing like it. So we knew serotype 3 was the culprit.
And second comes our TTSH.
Saying,
Yeah.
The veil had been lifted. The victims were infected by the same strain of Group B Streptococcus, serotype 3 sequence type 283, or ST283 GBS for short.
so when we realized that we really did have an outbreak going on, not just a suspicion, then the obvious question is, well, what can we do to stop it? We know this organism is not going to be spread by the respiratory route. We know people aren't going to pick it up from the environment. It had to be food-borne. Bacteria are killed by heat, so it had to be something that is not cooked. So the next step, of course, was to ask, people started asking their patients. And anecdotally, all the patients saying, yeah, I have raw fish in my porridge.
Within days of discovery, the Ministry of Health published a public advisory to warn people against eating raw freshwater fish.
All raw fish dishes containing freshwater fish is off the menu with immediate effect. The joint announcement by the Health Ministry, National Environment...
Back at the hospital, Tan lies unconscious. He is put on a potent dose of antibiotics and medication to direct his bloodstream to where it's needed most, his major organs, to ward them off the bacteria.
昏迷醒来之后是2个星期吧。我醒来的时候我就没有办法坐起来嘛，就只能看用眼睛这样子扫一下扫一下，看到我的手脚都已经黑了。
With limited blood flow and oxygen, tissues in his hands and feet start dying.
有一次有一个见习医生哈，他就巡访，我就问他了，我说我的手跟脚几时会好？然后就说你的手脚不会好了，就要等剧而已。我听到就整个人傻掉了，好像去法庭被判了死刑这样子，等到那个时间来把你的手脚切掉这样子，就等死了好像。
Tan's life was saved, but not his limbs.
今天就是我截肢手的纪念日了，5年前，8月21号。
ST283 GBS cases like this are unheard of in Singapore, so Barkham started to dig deeper.
There were less than 4 reports of this in the whole world literature. Amongst humans, there were 2 reports, one from Hong Kong several years ago, and a report from France where they had 2 cases. In addition to that, there was a report of 2 fish, one from Thailand and one from Vietnam. And that constituted all the publications in the world literature on sequence type 283. We have Singapore down here with our human outbreak represented by the smiley. We had the report from Hong Kong that was in humans, and we had 2 fish. Well, to me, this meant it's a regional outbreak.
There were further questions. Are the different strains of ST283 GBS from different places related? Are the ones found in fish the same ones that infected people? These were crucial questions which could only be answered by mapping out the bacteria's entire DNA sequence.
When you've got a fingerprint at the scene of the crime, you can identify the exact individual that was there. We can do the same kind of identification using whole genome sequencing. So what we could do was take a genomic fingerprint of bacteria present on fish, and also a genomic fingerprint of bacteria isolated from the bloodstream of humans. And we found that those were a perfect match in that case.
Although ST283-GBS is commonly found in freshwater fish, there hadn't been any documented cases of transmission to humans, and it was not thought to be a food-borne disease at that time.
If we know that Group B streptococcus is causing infection in humans and it's coming through the fish, then having a vaccine for the fish would be one way that we could ensure that the food supply is safe.
After the 2015 outbreak, the Genome Institute of Singapore designed a test to detect ST283-GBS, helping doctors to identify and treat infections more efficiently. A separate test for the fish is also in the works.
Bacteria are incredibly diverse. 2 random E. coli might be different by 2 to 3% in their DNA. Okay? And just to give you a point of context, humans and chimpanzees are about 1% difference. If we understand how it is that bacteria are able to cause disease, for example, with Group B streptococcus, which seems to recently have gained the ability to become foodborne, if we understand how that change happened, maybe we could anticipate that change or look for that change in other bacteria so that when it happens, we can also catch that as early as possible.
There are more bacteria in the world than stars in the universe, by about 1 billion-fold. And there is no telling where the next infection will come from.
ये जो है यहाँ पानी है, ठीक है? और ये फेफड़े के अंदर दाग भी है। आप मेरे पास पानी के लिए आए थे, लेकिन मैंने आपका ये देखा तो इसके अंदर दाग था, इसलिए बलगम कराया। बलगम में कीटाणु आ रहे हैं, फैलने वाला टीबी है। ले सकते हो।
Pawan has just received news that he has tuberculosis.
जब आप खांसोगे, छींकोगे, बोलोगे, तो ये मुंह से कुछ निकलते हैं, वो फिर हवा में रहते हैं, और फिर वो जो स्वस्थ आदमी होता है, वो अंदर लेता है, तो उसके अंदर वो कीटाणु चले जाते हैं। लेकिन जैसे ही कभी कोई बीमार हो, 1 हफ्ते के अंदर जांच करानी है और हमें बताना है। अब टीबी पेशेंट कैन स्प्रेड infection to 10 to 15 persons in a year. Our country is thickly populated and the conditions are humid. It's very difficult to control the environment as well as infection.
India currently sees the highest number of TB cases in the world. But the disease does not discriminate. It never has. Once a quarantine station in the late 19th century, St. John's Island, 6.5 kilometers south of mainland Singapore, is today a destination for outdoor enthusiasts.
It's a really nice day to be out.
The concept of quarantine traces back to biblical times, evidence of human struggle against pathogens since the beginning of history, including tuberculosis or TB. Microbiologist Wilfred Moreira first came to Singapore to lead drug discovery projects targeting TB. He developed an interest in TB while he was working on his PhD dissertation on neglected diseases.
Tuberculosis can be dated back for as far as tens of thousands of years. So tuberculosis remained one of the greatest bacterial killers throughout human history. By the 1900s, TB had killed 1 in 7 people that have ever lived on the planet. It was named the White Plague or the Great Consumption because people lost a tremendous amount of weight and they had these pale figures.
Because of its epidemic proportions, TB was coined Captain of All These Men of Death by English writer John Bunyan, evoking the despair and horror of the disease.
There were no cure for tuberculosis for the longest time. The only treatment options were fresh air in sanatorium.
It's not till 1882 when Robert Koch, a German physician, discovered the cause. The bacteria, known as Mycobacterium tuberculosis, spread through the air.
When people get exposed to droplets that contain the bacteria, and then there is possibly two ways. Your immune system does not control it. The bacteria replicates, and you go into active TB, and you're sick. Or it controls it, and it eradicates the bacteria, or it controls it, but the bacteria remains there, dormant. And that's what we call latent TB. As a matter of fact, we consider that 1/3 of the world population have been exposed and somewhat infected by tuberculosis.
Hard to treat and hard to detect, Mycobacterium tuberculosis are tricky organisms. Not only are they protected with a waxy coating of fats, making them hard to be killed, they also have an ingenious way of hiding in our bodies by allowing themselves to be eaten by white blood cells, the very cells that would normally kill them. There they stay dormant and develop into latent TB. When the carrier's immune system weakens, the bacteria spring to life, replicating with a vengeance. Today, this millennia-old disease is still killing 1.5 million people worldwide every year.
मैम इस दवाई कब तक ठीक हो जाऊंगा? मेरे को डर लगा, डिप्रेशन में जा चले गया था 3-4 दिन से मैं।
नहीं, डिप्रेशन की क्या बात है भाई? देखो, आपको ऐसी बीमारी है जिसका इलाज है हमारे पास, तो बस आपको ये करना है, लग के दवाई खानी है, नशे को छोड़ना है, अच्छा खाना खाना है, बचाव करना है अपना भी और दूसरों का भी, तो धीरे धीरे करके ठीक हो जाएंगे। आगे जब तक ठीक नहीं होंगे हम नहीं छोड़ेंगे।
कुछ 6 महीने तक, जब तक आपकी दवाई चलती है, आपको कंटिन्यू एक भी दिन बिना छोड़े दवाई खानी है।
Unlike TB patients a century ago, Pawan and other patients today can look forward to a full recovery, thanks to the discovery and development of antibiotics. Summer 1928. Scottish bacteriologist Alexander Fleming comes back from a vacation and discovers that a green mold called Penicillium notatum has contaminated petri dishes of bacteria that he's growing in his lab. And it's killing them. This marked the beginning of the antibiotics revolution.
When penicillin was first mass-produced in the 1940s during World War II, it saved more lives than anything else. And currently, the surgeries that we do, the chemotherapy that we give for cancer, none of this would be possible without antibiotics. So antibiotics indeed is one of the milestones of modern medicine.
These miracle drugs come in two major categories: bactericidal and bacteriostatic. Bactericidal antibiotics like penicillin attack bacteria's protective cell walls. Without an outer membrane, the bacterium is defenseless, and with its DNA and RNA leaking out, it can no longer survive. Bacteriostatic antibiotics, like tetracycline on the other hand, interfere with the bacteria's protein production, DNA replication, and enzyme activity. All these stop the bacteria from growing, giving the body's immune system a fighting chance against the bacteria. Some antibiotics adopt both actions at the same time.
The golden age of antibiotics was in the 1950s and 1960s, where we developed a lot of new and different antibiotic compounds. And it seemed to be a true miracle at that time because we were curing all kinds of different infections and diseases.
Besides being a physician, Shu is also a chess international master and had represented Singapore in chess Olympiads. He sees some parallel in the game and how antibiotics combat bacteria.
We gave antibiotics for people with cough and cold, where they did not have any bacterial infections.
Just like a chess player's overconfidence could lead to rash moves, the widespread availability of antibiotics led to careless and excessive use.
We found that low doses of antibiotics could make animals like pigs and chickens grow much faster and fatter and healthier, and so we started to give it as a growth promoter.
It's estimated that about 3/4 of all antibiotics dispensed in the world are used in livestock and agriculture.
Khỏe mạnh. Đang là khô đã các thứ đây. Vâng, đây thầy xem. Rất chi là tốt. Đây, ok. Bắt kêu mầm.
Healthy and larger animals translate into profit and livelihood for poultry farmers.
Đang pha thuốc cho gà uống.
Driven by economic reasons, adding antibiotics in animal feed is a common practice.
Thuốc collagen kết hợp với lại amoxicillin để đặc trị luôn cả E. coli trong con gà. Cái tác dụng của nó lúc úm này cho gà uống thuốc để nó tăng sức đề kháng cho con gà. Thì con gà nó khỏe mạnh thì nó hấp thụ được thức ăn tốt hơn.
Dr. Pham Duc Phuc from Hanoi University of Public Health has been conducting research all across Vietnam to understand how extensive antibiotics usage in animal farms like this is.
Lấy cái mẫu phân của gà để về làm xét nghiệm. Để xét nghiệm xem là cái dư lượng kháng sinh nó còn tồn dư trong phân hay không.
Antibiotics have helped decrease infection and mortality rates amongst livestock, making animal proteins affordable to the masses. A good economic and social move in the eyes of many, but problems are arising.
Bên cạnh đó thì nếu như sử dụng kháng sinh không đúng cách và nó không thì rất có thể cái nguy cơ gây ra làm cho cái vi sinh vật nó có mang đột biến gen và nó gây ra cái hiện tượng kháng thuốc. Vi sinh vật nó vẫn đang phát triển và con vật có thể ốm và có thể không cứu chữa được. Bên cạnh đó thì những cái vi sinh vật mang gen kháng thuốc đó có thể nó thất thoát ra môi trường bên ngoài và con người chúng ta vô tình bị nhiễm phải những cái vi sinh vật mang cái gen kháng thuốc đó.
So the equation is quite a simple one. The more antibiotics we use, the greater the pressure on the bacteria to become resistant to it because they also want to survive and flourish.
In the fight against bacteria, our aggression has made our foe stronger. The tables have turned, and humanity now faces an uphill battle.
It becomes a kind of evolutionary race, right? Like an arms race. We humans so far are losing this evolutionary race. And when antibiotic resistance reaches a level where common infections can no longer be so easily treated, medical procedures like transplants, surgeries, and chemotherapy will be at much higher risk.
If nothing changes, by 2050, 10 million people could die of antimicrobial resistant infections every year.
घर पे मतलब सीधी जो वो है एयर और सनलाइट है वो नहीं आती, थोड़ा कंजस्टेड सा एरिया.
Diagnosed with MultiDrug Resistant Tuberculosis almost 4 years ago, Tanya is still fighting the disease after numerous rounds of treatment.
2017 में हुआ था मुझे, जब पहली बार डायग्नोज हुआ था. मुझे 3 साल हो गया है मुझे कोर्स को कंप्लीट वो करे हुए.
It's a challenging patient. When she came to us, she was 17 years old and we started her on MDR TB regimen. She was doing very well. She was taking the drugs and all her sputum came negative. But the last culture which we sent there for the IRL lab, that came positive and she was resistant to few drugs. तो अभी आपको ऐसे ही कंटिन्यू करनी है दवाई, ECG वगैरह सब ठीक है, दवाइयाँ बिल्कुल ठीक चल रही हैं, कोई परेशानी नहीं हो रही. The problem with us is that the bacteria keeps on multiplying and it mutates also. So when her culture and sputum came negative, then maybe the bacteria was not mutating and it was regressing. But maybe few bacteria were left there, and when the drugs were stopped, they kept on multiplying and they mutated also.
Every bacterium's sole life mission is to become two, no matter what it takes. All bacteria adapt and mutate to survive and replicate. So does Mycobacterium tuberculosis, spreading to every corner of the earth. Singapore, February 2012. A young man was diagnosed with multidrug resistant TB, or MDR TB. 4 others in a gaming centre that he frequented were also infected.
We had a cluster of multidrug resistant TB cases among locals, which is very unusual. And these were in young men who were otherwise healthy, which is also unusual. But the one thing they share in common, they stayed for hours in an air-conditioned room, which is ideal for the spread of tuberculosis.
At this time, the young man also infected his flatmate in the suburb of Ang Mo Kio. 2 years later, in 2014, a neighbour living 2 apartments away came down with multidrug resistant TB. Then, in 2015, his flatmate's mother was found to be infected, and so was a resident who stayed in a flat 3 floors directly above them. A year later, in May 2016, another case was detected in the same apartment block. Multidrug-resistant TB cases are rare in modern Singapore, so it's highly unusual to have 6 cases detected within the same building. TB was once a major public health risk in Singapore in the early to mid-20th century, when living conditions were unsanitary and congested. With robust urban renewal and public health programs, the disease was brought under control. Beginning in the mid-1950s, every child born in Singapore is given a TB vaccine, Bacillus calmette-guerin, or BCG. The vaccine is primarily effective in protecting children against the more severe type of TB that causes meningitis.
So from 1958 to the late 1990s, the TB rates declined tremendously. And then they went down again after the establishment of the Singapore Tuberculosis Elimination Program. But from the year 2008 on, the rates of TB have stagnated. So there are roughly about 2,000 new TB cases every year in Singapore.
This is 10 times higher than that of the United States or Australia. Compounded with growing antibiotics resistance, rising TB cases will be especially concerning. Housed in this European-styled bungalow is the TB control unit that has been seeing patients for more than half a century.
Okay, so do you have any symptoms at all? For example, say a cough?
I had a mild cough, but I always thought that was due to stress because I was staying up all night.
Okay, and how long has this been for?
Maybe like a month or 2.
Okay.
It only occurs at night though.
So if you see, the upper parts of your lungs have some white shadows. This means that some parts of your lungs have been affected by an infection. So if you see this area here, can you tell that it is whiter than the other parts of the lung?
Yeah.
This is very typical for TB. TB is a germ that usually affects the upper part of your lungs.
I have TB.
Yes, you do.
I thought that was eradicated in Singapore.
A lot of the initial reaction is usually shock, like they would usually ask us, "Doctor, how is it possible I have TB? Are you sure there's TB in Singapore?" Because they would think that TB is a disease of the past. The nurses will be collecting some sputum specimens from you in order for us to do testing to see how much TB germs that you may have, as well as to find out whether your germs are sensitive to the medications that we are currently going to give you. If you would just follow me.
Sure.
The molecular test gives us a very rapid diagnosis within 2 hours on whether a patient is drug resistant.
Please, you take another deep breathing and cough out until you have some phlegm come into your mouth.
We need to find out, how much germs the patient has. When we look under the microscope to look at the number of TB germs that we're able to see compared to someone in whom we are unable to see any germs, we can say that, look, you're probably more infectious than the other person. Infectiousness is important because it helps us to determine the duration of treatment as well, and to see how far we want to extend our contact tracing.
Your privacy is important to us. We will not reveal your identity if they come here for screening. Okay. So could you let me know who you have in contact or prolonged contact with in the past few months before you were started on TB treatment?
Unlike other infectious diseases, say like COVID, where patients would be required to be quarantined in order to stop the spread of germs, in TB, taking the medications faithfully, regularly, keeps the germs at a very low level so that our patients are allowed to go outside to live their life as per normal.
In Singapore, our patients take this medication under directly observed therapy, which means that you will need to go to the nearest polyclinic or TBCU every day to take the medications under the supervision of a nurse.
By May 2016, the 6 multi-drug resistant TB cases in Ang Mo Kio had authorities concerned. Singapore's Ministry of Health started extensive contract tracing and investigations to piece together the puzzle.
And the investigations also included looking at the lifts. How was the air exchange in the lifts? Because that seems to be the most common points where people might encounter each other.
Despite these efforts, no clear transmission links could be established between the young man and his flatmates and the other cases. But one thing is clear. After developing symptoms, the young man didn't seek treatment till 4 months later.
I think a lot of times we are in denial. He was still quite well when he was diagnosed, and perhaps he felt well enough that he didn't think he needed to see a doctor. His sputum tests at that time showed that there was a lot of TB bacteria that could be seen even under the microscope.
During this period of high infectiousness, he had been staying at the flat, exposing his neighbors to high risk.
That's part of the problem of tuberculosis, which is this long latent period. Over 4 years, we have 6 cases, but that means that there are many more who have been infected and whom we have not found if we didn't go and test them.
As a precautionary measure, the Ministry of Health offered free and voluntary on-site TB screening to all past and current residents of the apartment block over 3 days.
I think that's a very fascinating example of how TB spreads in Singapore, or in any country for that matter, and how difficult it is actually to piece together what happened. And it was only because we have a very good team at contact tracing, and we have got very good molecular tools that we were able to understand what happened.
With increased globalization and urbanization, multi-drug resistant TB will continue to be a challenge for densely populated cities. We might see more cases in developed nations where TB is a forgotten disease. Professor Gan Yun Huen and her team have made an unnerving discovery. They spotted an unexpected and unwelcome characteristic in Klebsiella pneumoniae, a strain of bacteria resistant to the last line of antibiotics.
Wow. Yeah, this is more than 10 centimeters. Yeah, it's very hypermucoviscous, very sticky.
Very stringy and sticky coating is often found in hypervirulent bacteria strains that readily cause diseases but can normally be treated by antibiotics.
So these hypervirulent strains, they tend to overproduce their capsule. So they have this thick slime around them.
It is, however, not a common feature found in drug-resistant bacteria strains. Could these two strains have merged? Gan orders more tests, and the findings confirm her suspicions.
So these are strains that are both multi-drug resistant, carbapenem resistant, as well as hypervirulent.
This is the definition of a superbug, a bacteria that causes diseases easily and can't be treated by most antibiotics. What fascinated Gan was how these two strains converged. The antibiotic-resistant gene had penetrated the hypervirulent bacteria strain's thick cell wall.
People have hypothesized that there's this barrier that prevents the gene exchange, but we have found that it can happen and we can reproduce that in the lab to see that it happens at a high enough frequency to make it possible in the natural setting.
Superbugs are a growing public health crisis. They already infect hundreds of thousands of people worldwide. Many will not survive without effective treatment.
Antimicrobial drug resistance is similar to climate change in that it is a slowly encroaching upon us, like the frog sitting in a pot of warming water. The water is slowly coming to a boil. At some point, we might reach a place or a point of no return.
It's much more profitable developing drugs that treat chronic diseases as people require daily doses, and not medications that are only to be taken when needed and prescribed and used with discretion. This is why there hasn't been new antibiotics in the market in recent years. United Arab Emirates. Dr. Naveed Khan is looking for bacteria-killing molecules in an unlikely source, a universally detested pest. The idea came to Khan when he spotted cockroaches scurrying away as he ushered his children to wash their hands in the bathroom.
How come these species are able to resist or protect themselves against infectious diseases that we are telling our children that we have to constantly wash our hands and use antibacterial soaps? Cockroaches, they have been here for more than 300 million years. These species have been so successful in adapting and evolving, they must have some molecules in them to protect them against infectious diseases.
Khan believes if we can identify such molecules in the cockroaches, they could help us.
We dissected all parts of cockroaches, and surprisingly, instead of gut or muscles or even the blood, which is known as hemolymph for cockroaches, we found more powerful antibacterial activity in the brains of cockroaches. When we inoculated these brain lysates and then we put them together with the superbug commonly known as MRSA, just less than 5 microgram of cockroach brain lysate was able to kill more than 1 million superbugs completely. 100% kill rate. We've tested them against a range of different kinds of human cells, and none of these molecules were toxic to human cells. They were only proving very potent against bacteria.
Khan wants to bring the molecules into animal testing with an acute sense of urgency.
We're really heading towards a more or less pre-antibiotic era where none of the antibiotics will be effective if we do not come up with novel antibacterials.
The race is on. Scientists all over the world are hunting for a solution to antibiotic resistance. And nature might just have something else to offer.
And if you look around you, we can take a drop of that water, we can dig a little bit in that soil, and I'm pretty sure we'll find bacteriophages.
Literally meaning bacteria eater. Bacteriophages, or phages for short, are bacteria's natural nemesis. They are viruses that live within bacteria. A phage has a 20-sided head atop a long tail with leg-like fibres. It infects its victim by puncturing through the cell wall and injecting its DNA, hijacking the bacteria's resources to replicate itself. Within minutes, its victim is overrun by brand new phages. In one final blow, the phage expresses an enzyme that punches holes in the bacteria, bursting it and releasing new phages. Phages were discovered independently by two scientists, Frederick Tort and Phyllis Darrell, in the early 20th century. By the 1940s, with the advent of antibiotics in the West, phage studies were sidelined.
George Eliava, who studied under Felix Darrell, went back to his country, Georgia, in Tbilisi, the capital, where he established a phage research center. So although the rest of Europe and the rest of the world were developing antibiotics, in Georgia, and then later on in the Soviet Union, bacteriophages have been continuously used for the last 100 years. And at some point, I think every soldier of the Russian army had vials of bacteriophage preparation on them.
As antibiotic resistance rises, interest in bacteriophages has surged.
Phages and bacteria have co-evolved for eons of years. When bacteria will develop resistance to phages, phages will also evolve.
Besides being a living and evolving natural bacteria killer, phages have another edge.
When you use antibiotics, it's the equivalent of a carpet bombing. You kill all bacteria indiscriminately, including the very good bacteria. Bacteriophages are like a sniper shot. They only infect and kill a very specific bacteria, and they leave the good bacteria intact and unaffected.
Over the past 2 years, Morera and his team have built one of the largest bacteriophage banks in Southeast Asia, housed in the National University of Singapore. And they're constantly looking out for more.
We are also developing what we call genetic engineering capabilities to basically make them stronger and more efficacious.
While nature offers ready-made bacteria killers like phages, scientists at Nanyang Technological University are designing their own bacteria assailant. They are creating a compound out of histidine, one of the 7 essential amino acids in the human body. By joining together a long chain of synthetic histidine molecules. This polymer is the brainchild of Professor Mary Chan.
Antimicrobial polymers are very beautiful in the sense that they are large chain molecule, so they are made of many repeats of the same. After the polymer kills the bacteria, you can program your polymer so that it can degrade and break down into smaller pieces, then are non-toxic, and they can be easily excreted by our body.
Another beauty about Chan's polymer is its unique attack mechanism. Being positively charged, the polymer gets attracted to negatively charged bacteria. Once it lands on the surface, the polymer penetrates the bacteria's respiratory pathway. There it delivers the final deadly punch by trapping the bacterium's DNA. Chan's design also makes it harder for bacteria to evolve resistance.
Although bacteria can change the charge, but not very easily, because it's a physical characteristic. Another reason is that it's hard for the bacteria to overcome all these multiple targets coming together.
The polymer has been tested successfully against the superbug in Professor Gan's lab. The team has high hopes to develop the polymer into a new antibiotic in the near future. Meanwhile, it can be first introduced as an antibacterial coating on medical devices and diabetic wound dressings.
Bacteria will always be with us, but we need to kill them with something that are sustainable and that are environmentally friendly. And I think maybe polymer science is one of the few ways that you can do so.
We live and breathe with bacteria all around us. Some might say humans are tenants on an earth full of bacteria. How do we find a way to live with them harmoniously?
A treasure chest of bacteria. It's the latest set, safely stored.
Another strain of bacteria is added to Dr. Barkham's collection. This freezer is his arsenal.
We had been collecting bacteria since I came here, back in the UK where I trained, where they did the same thing. They wanted to know where the bacteria came from. They wanted to be able to characterize the bacteria so they could watch changes. Because by watching changes, we understand what's happening and it enables us to maybe put in an intervention. It's all about enabling a future investigation. That's why we save these bacteria.
While not knowing where and when the next bacteria pandemic might be, armed with tools to investigate and to develop new defenses, disease hunters are ready for the battle.